It was a gray, chilly Monday morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Washington, D.C. The McKinney family, like most families in the area, was gearing up for the week ahead. School, work, and daily routines filled the air with the hum of normalcy. But this Monday would be like no other, for it would be a day that would forever haunt the McKinney household and in the entire community. At 16 years old, Amber McKinney was the picture of high school success, smart, popular, and a star cheerleader. On the surface, her life seemed perfect. She had a supportive family, her dad, Chris, a local business owner, her mom, Laura, a high school teacher, and her two younger siblings, Kyle and Emma. They were the kind of family that others envied, always smiling, always together. Amber's friends would often comment on how lucky she was, how easy it all seemed. But under the surface, things were far from perfect. Amber had always felt a strange disdain for Mondays. She hated the pressure of the school week ahead, the constant expectation to excel, the cheerleading practices, the homework, the nagging voice of responsibility that followed her everywhere. To Amber, Mondays felt like a weight on her chest, crushing her slowly as she faced the same routine over and over again. For weeks, Amber had been distant. She spent more time in her room than ever before, her phone buzzing constantly as she exchanged messages with friends, but never really letting them in. Her family noticed the change, but Amber always brushed it off with a fake smile, claiming she was just tired from school and practice. But no one knew the truth. No one knew how close Amber was to the edge, how much she despised the world she had been forced into. Then on that fateful Monday morning, Amber snapped. It started as any other day. Her mother called her down for breakfast, her father left for work early, and her little brother Kyle bounced around the kitchen, eating cereal and asking his usual barrage of questions. Amber didn't respond to any of them. She stared blankly out the window, watching the dull rain fall outside. Her mind was elsewhere, far from the cozy family kitchen, far from the comforting voices of her parents. All she could think about was how much she hated Mondays, how much she hated her life, and how no one could understand. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "Amber, you all right? You're awfully quiet this morning." Amber forced a smile, her voice barely audible. "Yeah, I'm fine." But deep down, something inside her had already broken. Something snapped, and she could feel the anger bubbling up inside her. She wanted out. She didn't want to be trapped in this life any longer. She wanted to escape, and she would do whatever it took to make it happen. The next moments would be the last peaceful ones the McKinney family would ever experience. Amber stood up slowly, walking past her parents and younger brother, who were still sitting at the table, oblivious to what was about to unfold. She went to the pantry, grabbed a small, innocuous-looking can of lighter fluid, and snuck upstairs to her room. It was only a matter of time before the fire would begin. The fire would start in the kitchen, in the heart of the home, where everyone gathered each morning. Amber had planned it meticulously, pouring the lighter fluid along the edges of the kitchen counter, soaking the cabinets and floors. She knew the house well enough to understand where the fire would spread quickest. She wasn't stupid, she just didn't care anymore. As the fire grew, Amber returned to her room, shutting the door behind her. She sat on her bed staring at the flames creeping down the hallway and felt a strange sense of relief. It was happening. The end of her unbearable Monday mornings. The end of everything that had held her captive. The fire quickly escalated, engulfing the kitchen and spreading throughout the house. Within minutes, smoke began to fill the rooms, and the once peaceful McKinney home turned into a raging inferno. Outside, the neighborhood remained unaware of the nightmare unfolding inside the McKinney household. A passerby saw smoke rising from the windows and called 911. But by the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The fire had consumed everything in its path. Amber sat in her room, her back against the wall, as the sirens wailed in the distance. She felt strangely calm, almost numb. The guilt, if it existed, hadn't reached her yet. She had done it. She had finally freed herself from the life she had come to despise. The fire was still burning as the firefighters arrived, and Amber didn't care to look. Her life, as she had known it, was over, and in her mind, she was free. Detective John Myers was the first to arrive at the scene. He had been working in the city's homicide division for over 10 years. but nothing could have prepared him for the tragedy he was about to witness. As he stepped out of his car and surveyed the still smoking ruins of the McKinney home, his heart sank. The fire had been brutal, and the loss of life was undeniable. But something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The fire had spread too quickly, too deliberately. As he entered the wreckage, he saw the bodies: Chris, Laura, Kyle, and little Emma. Their charred remains were scattered across the living room, where they had been trapped by the flames. But the one thing that caught his eye was Amber's absence. She was nowhere to be found. Her room was untouched by the fire, and there were no signs of her anywhere in the house. This wasn't an accidental fire. Myers' instincts told him that this was no simple tragedy. Amber McKinney was missing, and Detective Myers knew that he would need to dig deeper into the family's life to uncover the truth. What he didn't know was just how deeply this case would go, or how much darkness lay behind the seemingly perfect life of the McKinney family. The smoke still hung thick in the air as Detective John Myers stood amidst the wreckage of the McKinney family home. The fire had ravaged everything, leaving only charred remnants of what had once been a picture-perfect suburban household. His gut told him that there was more to this tragedy than met the eye, and he wasn't one to overlook the details. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was calculated, deliberate, and someone had planned it. Amber McKinney, the 16-year-old cheerleader, was nowhere to be found. Her absence was the first red flag. She had been a model student, popular among her peers, and from all appearances, she had a perfect life, the perfect family. But now, with the charred remains of her parents and younger siblings, the investigation took a dark turn. The first thing Myers did was secure the perimeter. The fire had been fierce, but enough of the structure remained to allow for a detailed search. He worked with the fire marshal to determine the point of origin. They quickly ruled out an electrical fault or any natural causes. This fire had been started deliberately with an accelerant, likely the lighter fluid found in the pantry. The investigators combed through the house, looking for any sign that could point to Amber's involvement. What they found was unsettling. Amber's room was untouched by the flames. The windows were closed, the door locked, and there were no signs of a struggle. It looked as if Amber had planned to be absent when the fire started, almost as if she had left intentionally. But why? Myers walked through the house methodically, cataloging each piece of evidence. The fire had consumed everything in its path, but the intensity of the blaze didn't seem to match the randomness of it. There was a purpose behind this, and Myers couldn't shake the feeling that it had been orchestrated by someone who knew exactly how to set it up. As Myers moved through the house, he stumbled upon a small, locked drawer in Chris McKinney's office desk. It had survived the fire, unlike most of the other furniture. After a few attempts, he managed to pry it open. Inside, he found a collection of documents, life insurance papers, a few personal letters, and an account statement that seemed out of place. The name on the statement wasn't Chris McKinney's, it was Amber McKinney's. Myers felt a wave of unease wash over him. What was this? Why would Amber have life insurance papers in her name, hidden away in her father's office? And why did it feel like Chris had been keeping something from the rest of the family? The next day, Myers brought in the McKinney family's closest friends, neighbors, and colleagues for questioning. His first stop was at Amber's high school. If there was one place where someone might have insight into her state of mind, it was there. He met with Coach Harris, the cheerleading coach, and a teacher at the school. She was visibly shaken by the news of the fire and the loss of the McKinney family, but she had an interesting perspective on Amber. According to Coach Harris, Amber had been distant in the past few weeks, not the bubbly, confident cheerleader she had always been. She had been increasingly late to practice and often seemed distracted, as though her mind was elsewhere. "Amber's a great kid," Coach Harris said, her voice heavy with sadness. "But recently something just wasn't right. She wasn't herself. She was always telling me she didn't want to be there, that Mondays were the worst. It's like she had this dark energy about her." It was hard to explain, but it was there. Myers listened intently. He knew that people often didn't show their true feelings on the surface, but this felt like a clue. Amber had hated Mondays. The idea that something as seemingly simple as a day of the week could trigger this kind of reaction made Myers question what Amber had been going through in the weeks leading up to the fire. He asked Coach Harris about Amber's relationships, friends, boyfriends, and family. But Coach had nothing but praise for Amber's social life. She was loved by everyone. She had a close-knit group of friends, and she was always smiling. I can't imagine why she would do something like this. Later that afternoon, Myers visited the McKinney's next-door neighbor, Mrs. Grant. She had lived beside the family for years and had always been friendly with them. Mrs. Grant told him she had seen Amber leave the house just after breakfast on the morning of the fire. But what caught Myers' attention was the way Mrs. Grant described Amber's behavior. She was quiet that morning, Mrs. Grant recalled. I saw her walk down the driveway like she was going to school. But then she stopped and looked back at her house. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Now I wonder if she knew something was about to happen. This was the first concrete piece of evidence that confirmed Amber had intentionally left the house before the fire began. It was an important lead, but it didn't explain why Amber had chosen to disappear, nor why she had seemingly started the fire. As the investigation unfolded, Myers learned that Amber's relationship with her family wasn't as perfect as it had seemed. Through interviews with extended family members, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. Amber had grown increasingly resentful of her parents' pressure to be perfect. Her mother, Laura, had high expectations for Amber's academic success, and her father, Chris, had pushed her to follow in his footsteps, even suggesting she take over the family business one day. Amber had long felt that her parents' love was conditional, based on her achievements rather than who she truly was. But it wasn't just her parents. Amber had also struggled with the pressure of being a cheerleader, the perfect girl everyone looked up to. Behind the smile and the accolades, Amber felt suffocated. She had no room to be herself. Myers discovered that Amber had been researching how to disappear for weeks leading up to the fire. She had looked up ways to start a fire in her home, the quickest and most effective ways to escape undetected. It was all there, in her search history, hidden behind her seemingly innocent online behavior. As the investigation continued, Myers began to piece together the pieces of Amber's broken life. The fire had been no accident. It was an act of desperation, a way for Amber to escape the pressures of her perfect family and her perfect life. She had planned everything meticulously, the fire, her disappearance, and the death of her family. She had finally acted on the resentment that had been building inside her. But why? Why did Amber feel the need to kill her family in such a brutal, calculated way? Was it truly just the pressure of being the perfect daughter? Or was there something darker at play? Myers' instincts told him that this wasn't just about a teenager rebelling. There was more to this case. Something darker. Something Amber had been hiding for much longer than anyone realized. As the case went on, Amber's whereabouts remained unknown. But Detective Myers wasn't giving up. He knew the truth was out there, and with every piece of evidence, he was getting closer to understanding the twisted reasoning behind Amber's actions. The answers lay in the past, hidden behind the mask of perfection she had worn for so long. And Myers was determined to uncover every last secret Amber had buried, no matter the cost. The days after the fire were a whirlwind of investigation, police reports, and interviews. Detective Myers worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of what had led to the McKinney family's tragic end. Each clue uncovered more about Amber McKinney, her personality, her relationships, and the intense pressure she had been under. But something still didn't add up. Why would a seemingly normal teenage girl go to such lengths to destroy everything she had? The more Myers delved into Amber's life, the more he realized that the truth was not going to be as simple as he initially thought. The first breakthrough came when the autopsy reports were completed. The McKinney family's cause of death was officially listed as smoke inhalation, but the report also included a disturbing detail: traces of lighter fluid found on Chris McKinney's clothing. Amber had used the accelerant not only to start the fire, but also to make sure it spread fast and hot enough to trap her family inside. It confirmed that this wasn't just an accident. This was premeditated. But the most chilling part of the report was the discovery that the fire had been started before Amber left the house. That meant she had intentionally gone to school or elsewhere, knowing that the fire was set to consume the house and everyone inside it. Amber hadn't been caught in the blaze, which meant she had planned her escape from the beginning. She was smarter than anyone had realized. Myers spent the next few days reviewing Amber's life, trying to make sense of the girl who had been adored by her community and teachers, but had carried such a dark secret. He interviewed more people who had known Amber well, classmates, friends, and teachers, looking for any clues about her mental state or her relationships with her family. Amber had been a star cheerleader, adored by her classmates, and her teachers spoke of her with respect. But the more Myers learned, the more he saw a different side of her. Amber's social media profile painted a picture of a life full of achievements and celebrations. But when he dug deeper, he found a trail of cryptic posts and private messages that suggested a far more complex inner world. In one message to a close friend, Amber had written, "I can't keep up anymore. They all want me to be perfect, but I'm not perfect. I'm just so tired." It was the kind of message that spoke to the pressure she had been under for years. Amber had always felt like she had to live up to the expectations of her family, her friends, and her school. She had never been able to take a break from being perfect. Amber's mother, Laura, had high academic expectations for her, pushing her to be the best in everything she did. Her father, Chris, had been involved in the family's successful small business and had always wanted Amber to take over one day. He pushed her to excel in business as well as academics. But what no one had noticed was how the stress of these expectations had worn Amber down over time. She had never had a chance to simply be herself. She was always playing a role, constantly living up to someone else's idea of who she was supposed to be. Myers discovered that Amber had grown resentful of her parents in the weeks leading up to the fire. Her conversations with friends had shifted from typical teenage concerns to something more troubling. She spoke about how she couldn't stand her mother's constant demands and how she felt trapped by her father's business expectations. But what struck Myers as most significant was Amber's frustration with Mondays. Every week, she expressed how much she hated the start of the school week, the pressure of cheerleading, the overwhelming academic demands, and the unrelenting expectations. Mondays, she said, were the hardest day of the week. It was the one day she felt the full weight of everything she couldn't escape. But it wasn't just her family that had caused her stress. Amber had also been struggling with her social life. She was constantly surrounded by friends, but they were all part of the same image she had been forced to uphold. They didn't see the cracks, the internal struggles she faced every day. To them, she was the perfect cheerleader, the model student, the girl everyone admired. But Amber had been suffering in silence, unable to confide in anyone, feeling isolated in a crowd. One evening, Myers met with the fire marshal to discuss the specifics of the fire. As they pored over the evidence, the fire marshal confirmed something Myers had suspected. The fire had been started in multiple places, both in the kitchen and in the hallway near the front door. It was a calculated decision. Amber had wanted to make sure the fire spread quickly, that there would be no escape for her family. And yet she had left the house, fully aware of the destruction that would unfold. "What gets me," the fire marshal said, flipping through his notes, "is how careful she was. She didn't just start a fire and hope for the best. She knew exactly how to spread it, how to ensure it consumed the house in minutes. This wasn't a cry for help. This was something far darker." Myers nodded, his mind turning. The more he learned about Amber's meticulous planning, the more disturbed he became. This wasn't just a girl snapping under pressure. This was cold, calculated murder. Amber had planned it for weeks, making sure that the fire would kill her family and leave no chance for anyone to survive. The breakthrough came when Myers uncovered Amber's journal. Hidden beneath a pile of school papers in her room, he found a small leather-bound notebook. It wasn't something Amber had hidden carefully, but it was something she had kept private. As he flipped through the pages, Myers began to understand just how deep Amber's anger and resentment ran. In one passage, Amber wrote, "I hate them. I hate how they make me feel like I'm not. Enough. I can't live up to their expectations anymore. I can't breathe. I'll make them pay." It was clear now that the fire had been Amber's way of exacting revenge on her family for the years of pressure they had put on her. They had never once allowed her to be herself. She had been pushed to the brink, and this was the only way she could see to escape. She had been suffocating under their expectations, and the fire had been her final act of defiance. But there was something else in the journal, an unsettling revelation. Amber had been planning her escape for weeks. She had researched how to start a fire, studied how to cover her tracks, and even looked up places to disappear. It wasn't just the fire that had been planned, it was her future after the fire. Amber had intended to leave, to run away and start over. But something had gone horribly wrong, and now she was missing. As Myers sat back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle finally started to fall into place. Amber had orchestrated the murder of her family, not out of a fit of rage in the moment, but as part of a carefully constructed plan. The weight of the world had driven her to this point, and now she had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the destruction she had caused. But where was Amber now? Where had she gone after committing such a horrific act? Myers knew the investigation was far from over. Amber was still out there somewhere. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized that Amber wasn't just a girl driven to madness by family pressure. She was someone who had planned every step of her escape, even if it meant leaving a trail of destruction behind. The question now was whether Amber would ever be found, and if she would face the consequences of the choices she had made. The hunt for Amber McKinney was just beginning. Amber McKinney had vanished without a trace. The search for the missing 16-year-old cheerleader had gripped the entire city, with every law enforcement officer and investigator focusing their efforts on locating her. Yet, despite their best efforts, Amber remained elusive. Her disappearance was as calculated as the fire she had set to destroy her family. But what drove her to commit such an unspeakable act? And where had she gone? Detective Myers was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant diving deeper into Amber's mind than anyone had ever dared before. The weeks after the fire were tense. Amber's case had made headlines, and the city buzzed with theories and gossip. The McKinney family had been well known and respected in the community, and now their tragic deaths were being dissected in every corner of the neighborhood. Amber, once admired for her cheerleading prowess and perfect academic record, was now a fugitive. The girl who had destroyed everything in her life and taken down her family in the process. The police had interviewed everyone who had known Amber, from her teachers to her closest friends. But each interview yielded the same response. Amber had been a model student, a popular cheerleader, but in recent weeks she had changed. No one had seen the signs of her brewing anger, not even those closest to her. One thing Myers noticed during these interviews was the recurring theme of Amber's apparent dislike for Mondays. It seemed like such a trivial thing to be fixated on, but in retrospect, it was a critical clue. It wasn't just the day of the week Amber hated, it was everything Mondays represented. They were the start of a new cycle, the school week, the pressure to be perfect, the never-ending demands. Mondays were a reminder of the life she felt trapped in. Myers sat at his desk late one evening, sorting through the case files. He reviewed Amber's online activity, her social media, and her school assignments, hoping to find a clue that would lead him to her. The more he dug, the more he saw the contradictions in her life. Amber's perfect facade had masked an inner turmoil that had been building for months, possibly even years. There was one message in particular that stood out. It was a text she had sent to her best friend Lily just a few days before the fire. The message read, "I can't take it anymore. Monday's the day. I'll be free." Free. It was a chilling word, one that sent a cold shiver down Myers' spine. What did Amber mean by free? Was it a reference to the fire? To the destruction she had set in motion? Or was it something darker? Was she planning something else? The next day, Myers met with the police team to discuss the case. Despite their best efforts, Amber had left no trail. No one had seen her leave the house after the fire, and no one had been able to track her movements. She was a ghost, someone who had vanished as if she never existed. But Myers wasn't ready to give up. He needed to think like Amber. He needed to get inside her head, understand what had driven her to commit such a horrific act. And for that, he would have to dig deeper into her family dynamics, her relationship with her parents, the expectations that had suffocated her, and the pressures she had felt her whole life. Myers took a trip to the McKinney family's business, Chris McKinney's small construction company. It wasn't a high-profile business, but it was successful enough to provide for the family. The company's office was a modest space, tucked away in a quiet part of town. Inside, Myers found old files and documents that spoke to the meticulousness of the McKinney family's planning. Chris had been a hard worker, but the demands of running a business had clearly taken a toll on him. Amber had been expected to take over one day, but it was clear from the files that Chris had been pushing her to succeed in ways that had overwhelmed her. The pressure was suffocating, and Amber's own words from the past came flooding back to Myers. She had felt like a failure, like nothing she did was ever good enough. It wasn't just her father's business she had been pressured into taking over. It was her entire life. She had been molded to fit a perfect image, but deep down she had known it wasn't her. It was never her life to begin with. It wasn't until Myers found a journal hidden in Chris McKinney's office that things started to make sense. The journal, covered in dust and hidden in the back of a filing cabinet, contained a detailed record of the family's history. Chris's hopes for Amber, his dreams for her future, and his demands. In one entry, dated a month before the fire, Chris wrote, "Amber's not happy. I can see it in her eyes. She's trying to break free, but she doesn't understand that I'm doing this for her. I'm doing this for the family. She'll thank me one day. She'll see that I'm right. She'll take over the business, and she'll be grateful for the life I've given her." The words were chilling. Chris had never once questioned whether Amber wanted to take over the family business. He had assumed that she would, whether she was ready or not. He had placed an enormous weight on her shoulders, believing that she would one day embrace the future he had laid out for her. But Amber hadn't embraced it. She had resented it, and now that resentment had festered into something far darker. Myers began to understand Amber's mindset more clearly. She had been pushed beyond her limits, and in her desperation, she had decided to take control of her fate, no matter the cost. But why did she have to kill her family? Why couldn't she have just run away? As Myers continued his investigation, he uncovered a disturbing pattern in Amber's past. She had been planning her escape for months. She had researched how to start a fire, how to disappear, and even looked up ways to fake her own death. Amber had known exactly what she was doing when she set the fire. It wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was an act of finality, a way for Amber to reclaim control of her life in the most extreme way possible. But as Myers followed the trail of Amber's plans, a new question arose. If Amber had planned everything so carefully, why had she disappeared afterward? Why hadn't she just run away to start her new life? It wasn't long before the answer came. Amber had been planning to fake her death, to make it look like she had perished in the fire along with her family. But something had gone wrong. Amber had underestimated the fire's speed and intensity. She hadn't expected her family's deaths to be so violent. It was clear now that Amber had been so consumed by her desire to escape that she hadn't fully thought through the consequences of her actions. She had planned her freedom at the expense of her family's lives. But Amber hadn't accounted for one thing. The police weren't ready to let this case go. Myers was closing in, and Amber knew it. As the investigation unfolded, Amber's carefully laid plans began to unravel. She was out there somewhere, hiding, but Detective Myers wasn't about to let her slip away. Myers leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph of the McKinney family that had been taken just months before the fire. The smiling faces seemed so out of place now. Everything had seemed so perfect, so normal. And yet, beneath the surface, Amber had been drowning. Her family had pushed her to the breaking point, and now she was somewhere out there, alone, facing the consequences of her actions. The hunt for Amber McKinney was about to reach its breaking point. The truth would come out, but the question was, when? And would Amber be ready to face the consequences of her escape? Detective Myers sat at his desk, staring at the case files scattered across it. The Tapershinam, photographs of Amber McKinney, the charred remains of her family, the autopsy reports, and her journal entries all painted a troubling portrait of a young girl driven to desperation. Amber had meticulously planned her family's demise, believing she could escape the suffocating life they had imposed on her. Yet in the end, she had underestimated the consequences of her actions, and now she was on the run. But despite all the clues, despite the growing understanding of Amber's mindset, Myers was no closer to finding her. The girl who had once been the picture of success, the perfect cheerleader, had become a ghost. And no matter how much he dug, No matter how many leads he followed, Amber remained elusive. The case had begun to drag on, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted. The first step in the investigation was to track Amber's movements after the fire. Myers had already learned that she had left the house before the fire began, but where had she gone afterward? The night of the fire, there had been no sign of her, no calls, no texts, no social media activity. It was as though she had vanished off the face of the earth. Myers revisited the places Amber had frequented, her school, the local mall, her friends' houses, but no one had seen her. Her friends were scared, confused, and in disbelief, but none of them had any answers. Amber's disappearance seemed intentional, and it became clear that she had planned for it to look like she had died in the fire. The question remained, why had she disappeared afterward? Was she hiding from the law? Or had she truly believed that she could escape everything and start anew? Amber had left behind a trail of cryptic messages, texts, and clues, but they only seemed to lead to more questions. The diary entries that spoke of her frustrations and resentment painted a picture of a girl consumed by anger. But was it anger at her family? Or was there something more to Amber's motivations that no one had yet uncovered? Days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. Myers felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. He knew Amber was out there somewhere, and the more he thought about her life, the pressures, the expectations, the crushing weight of perfection, the more he realized that she had been pushed into a corner with no way out. But that didn't justify what she had done. The fire, the murder of her family, it was an act of violence that couldn't be explained away by mere frustration or resentment. Amber had crossed a line that most people could never even imagine. Then a break came when Myers received an unexpected tip. A man had called into the station, claiming to have seen Amber the night after the fire. The man, a truck driver who had been passing through a nearby town, said that he had spotted a girl matching Amber's description walking down a remote road late at night. The area was a few hours outside of Washington, D.C., a small town where Amber would have been unlikely to be recognized. It was the kind of place someone could disappear into, far from the watchful eyes of her friends and family. Myers wasted no time. He and his team immediately drove to the town, following up on the lead. They arrived in the quiet rural community just before dusk, with the hope that they could find any trace of Amber. It was the first real lead in weeks, and Myers felt a renewed sense of determination. The town was small, too small for much to happen unnoticed. The local diner, where the truck driver had claimed to have seen Amber, was a gathering spot for the town's residents. Myers and his team entered, hoping to find someone who could confirm the sighting. After a few minutes, a woman behind the counter spoke up. "You're looking for that girl, aren't you?" she asked, her tone cautious. "I remember her. She came in a few nights ago, was acting strange, like she didn't belong. Had the look of someone running away. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I've heard the news. The McKinney family, it's tragic what happened." Myers nodded, his mind racing. "Did she say anything? Where did she go after?" The woman paused, thinking. "She didn't talk much, just ordered coffee and stared out the window. But I remember she paid with cash, and she didn't seem to have any luggage or bags. After that, she left the diner and walked down the road toward the woods. I figured she was just passing through, maybe hitchhiking. The lead was significant. Amber had been here, in this small town, and she had been alone. But she had walked into the woods. Myers wasn't sure what that meant, but it was a place to start. He and his team followed the road where Amber had been last seen. The woods were dense, the trees thick and dark, and the area was quiet, eerily quiet. They spent hours combing through the forest, searching for any sign of Amber. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no indication that she had ventured deep into the woods. It was as if she had simply disappeared. The only sign they found was a small, abandoned shack near the edge of the woods. It was run down, overgrown with ivy, and had clearly been unused for years. But as they entered, Myers found something that made his stomach drop. A notebook, identical to the one found in Chris McKinney's office, lying on the floor. The pages were filled with Amber's handwriting, and the words were haunting. "I have to keep going. No one understands. I can't stay here." If I go back, they'll just make me be someone I'm not. I'll be free soon. I'll make it. They'll never find me. It was clear now. Amber had been planning this escape for a long time. She hadn't just killed her family. She had destroyed everything in her life in order to start over. She had planned to fake her own death and disappear forever. But something was off. Why had Amber left the shack? Why had she run if she had gone to such lengths to escape? The answer came when Myers received a phone call from a local woman who had seen a girl matching Amber's description in town a few days after the fire. She had been carrying a backpack, walking quickly, and had asked for a ride to a nearby city. The woman had been hesitant to give Amber a ride, but the encounter had stuck in her mind. Amber had been acting paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder as if she feared being followed. It became clear to Myers that Amber hadn't just wanted to escape. She was running from something else. The fire, the murder of her family. Those had been calculated steps, but they had been a means to an end. Amber had never truly wanted to disappear. She had been running, hiding from the life she had created for herself, from the guilt that consumed her. She was lost, both physically and emotionally. Myers had been chasing ghosts, and it seemed now that Amber had become one. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The case was far from over, and somewhere, out there in the shadows, Amber was hiding. And he would find her, no matter how long it took. The hunt had only just begun. Amber McKinney had become a shadow in her own life. The more Detective Myers searched, the more elusive she became. Every lead seemed to vanish into thin air, and as the weeks wore on, Amber's case became more of a mystery than ever. She had planned the fire, orchestrated the deaths of her family, and seemingly disappeared into the wilderness, leaving no trace. Yet Myers couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something more complex than simple revenge or a desire for freedom. Amber was not just running away from her family, she was running from herself. Myers knew the next step in the investigation was crucial. The clues he had uncovered in the shack in the woods, Amber's cryptic journal entries, and her sudden disappearance all pointed to one thing. Amber wasn't just a murderer on the run. She was in turmoil, consumed by guilt and fear. She had killed her family in an attempt to escape an unbearable situation, but now she had no place to go. The fire was her way of cutting the cords that bound her, but in doing so, she had become lost, both physically and emotionally. To understand Amber's state of mind, Myers needed to dive deeper into her personal life. The journal had shed light on her feelings of suffocation, but it also revealed something darker. Amber had been planning this for months. Her decision to murder her family wasn't a sudden outburst of anger. It was a carefully calculated act of desperation. Myers spent more time going over Amber's history, retracing her steps, and talking to people who had known her best. He began to piece together the web of lies, guilt, and unresolved feelings Amber had kept hidden from everyone, even from herself. The more he dug, the more he realized that Amber's life had been one long struggle against the expectations that had been placed on her, expectations she had never chosen but had been forced to bear since childhood. In a breakthrough, Myers received an anonymous tip from a woman who claimed to have seen Amber in a small town about 60 miles away from where she was last seen. This town, known for its remote, rural setting, was a place where people could disappear, hidden from the rest of the world. The woman described Amber as nervous and constantly looking over her shoulder, as if she was terrified that someone might find her. This was the first solid lead in weeks. Amber had been here, a stone's throw away from the community she had left behind. The woman hadn't offered much more information, but the mere fact that Amber had been spotted gave Myers hope. The girl wasn't gone forever. She was out there, hiding, but she was still alive. Myers and his team immediately set out to search the small town. It was a sleepy place with little activity aside from the local diner and a few businesses. The locals were quiet, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, as if the town knew something but didn't want to admit it. Myers spoke to the townspeople, gathering as much information as he could. People remembered seeing a girl who looked like Amber in the area, but no one had anything definitive to offer. It wasn't until he spoke with a local mechanic, a man named Carl, that things began to fall into place. Carl had a small shop on the edge of town, and he told Myers about a girl who had come in a few days ago, asking for a ride to the next town over. Carl hadn't recognized her at first, but after hearing about the McKinney fire on the news, he began to put the pieces together. The girl had been nervous and edgy, almost as if she was running from something, and Carl had gotten the distinct impression that she was trying to hide her identity. "I didn't want to get involved," Carl said, rubbing his hands together nervously. "She paid me for the ride, but I could tell something wasn't right. She didn't look like she belonged here, but she was desperate to get out. She told me she didn't have anywhere else to go." I didn't ask too many questions. The conversation with Carl was a turning point. Amber had been close, so close to being found, but she had slipped through their fingers once again. The fact that she had asked for a ride suggested she was still trying to escape, trying to move farther away from the life she had destroyed. But where had she gone? Where was she now? Myers returned to the station, his mind racing. Amber was out there somewhere, but she had managed to cover her tracks well. She was hiding, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply entrenched her fear was. Fear of being found. Fear of being held accountable for the murder of her family. But there was something else, something even more pressing, that he had missed. It wasn't just Amber's desire to escape her family. It was her need to escape the person she had become. The girl who had once been so full of promise had shattered under the weight of her life. Amber had thought she could escape by ending everything, but in the end, she had destroyed herself too. Myers sat at his desk late into the night, reviewing all the files he had accumulated. Something in the journal entries, the messages, and the interviews had stuck with him. Amber had always talked about escaping, but what if she wasn't just running from her family? What if she was running from something deeper, something she couldn't escape within herself? The answer came when Myers revisited Amber's school records. He noticed something he hadn't seen before. Amber had been under the care of a therapist. Her parents had arranged the therapy sessions, believing that Amber's increasingly erratic behavior was a phase. But the records revealed something far more troubling. Amber's therapist had documented a deep sense of guilt in Amber, stemming from the pressure she had felt throughout her life. Amber had written about feeling inadequate, unable to meet her parents' expectations, and how this sense of failure had weighed on her for years. The therapist had noted that Amber had begun showing signs of depression and isolation, and there were references to a growing resentment toward her family. The journal entries Amber had kept reflected similar sentiments, but there was one crucial entry that made Myers pause. It was dated just 2 days before the fire. "They don't understand. I've tried, but they don't see how broken I am. They don't see how much I'm drowning. I'll make them see. I'll make it stop." The pieces began to fall into place. Amber had been drowning in her own mind, unable to reconcile the perfect image everyone else had of her with the broken person she had become. Her family's expectations had suffocated her, and the pressure had driven her to the edge. The fire had been her way of not just escaping, but destroying the life that had been forced on her. Now Amber was hiding, not just from the police, but from the reality of what she had done. She had thought she could outrun the consequences, but the truth was catching up with her. Myers knew that Amber wasn't just a girl on the run. She was a girl who had lost herself in the process of trying to escape, and that would be the key to finding her. It wasn't just about finding Amber physically. It was about finding the pieces of her that had been lost and understanding the depth of her pain. Myers wasn't done yet. He was getting closer, and with each new revelation, the truth was beginning to emerge. Amber McKinney's story wasn't over yet, and neither was the search for her. Detective Myers stood in the small, dimly lit office, staring at the collection of photographs and evidence that now covered his desk. The case of Amber McKinney had gone from a tragic murder to something much darker. A story of a girl trapped in the pressure of a life she didn't want, driven to the edge, and ultimately to murder. Myers had followed every lead, pieced together Amber's fractured world, and understood the desperate act she had committed. But the question still loomed over him. Where was she now? Amber had been hiding for weeks. She had meticulously planned her escape, faked her own death, and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a wake of destruction. But Myers had learned more about her in the past few days than he had in the weeks leading up to the fire. Amber wasn't just running from her family, from her life, she was running from herself. And the deeper Myers got into Amber's psyche, the more he realized that finding her wasn't just about solving a case. It was about confronting a broken person who had lost everything, including her sense of identity. Myers spent the next few days following every new lead. He and his team had tracked Amber's movements to a small town on the outskirts of Virginia. But each time they got close, she seemed to vanish once more. He couldn't understand how someone who had been so smart, so calculating, could slip through their fingers time and time again. But Myers knew that Amber wasn't just trying to escape the law. She was trying to escape herself. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A call from the therapist who had been working with Amber surfaced a crucial detail. The therapist, Dr. Simone Carter, had been unaware of the severity of Amber's emotional distress until after the fire. Dr. Carter had revealed that Amber had been showing signs of dissociation in their last few sessions, as if Amber was no longer able to reconcile the different aspects of her identity: the cheerleader, the daughter, the student. Amber had mentioned something that struck Dr. Carter as odd. "I don't know who I am anymore. Maybe it's better if I just disappear." That was the key. Amber hadn't just wanted to escape. She had wanted to erase herself completely, to rid herself of everything that tied her to the life she had been forced to live. The fire had been her way of severing all connections, but now she was on the run, living a ghost's existence, no longer tied to any identity. Myers and his team reevaluated all of Amber's known associates and contacts. Amber had not left the area, they realized, and she hadn't gone as far as she thought she had. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Myers received a tip from a local diner owner in the small town of Virginia. She had seen a girl matching Amber's description just a day ago. The girl had come in alone, ordered coffee, and stared out the window as if she were waiting for someone or something. "I've seen her before, just not here," the diner owner said when she spoke to Myers. But she was different this time. She didn't talk to anyone, just sat there like she was lost in her own head. "I thought she was just passing through. Then I saw the news and realized who she was." Myers felt the familiar mix of anxiety and determination. Amber hadn't left. She had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for something. And now they had found her. The plan was set. Myers and his team would head to the diner the next morning. They knew Amber would likely be there, having set a routine for herself. But as the sun rose the next morning and the small town began to stir, Myers felt the unease settle in his chest. Amber wasn't just a fugitive. She was a person who had been pushed to her limits, someone who had taken matters into her own hands in an attempt to escape. But now she was completely alone, and Myers wasn't sure what he would find when they confronted her. At the diner, Myers watched as his team spread out, taking their positions, preparing to approach Amber without alarming her. He knew that this could go one of two ways. Amber could be the broken girl who needed help, or she could be the cold, calculating person who had murdered her entire family without remorse. Myers couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they entered the diner, Myers saw her immediately. She was sitting at a booth in the back, her face partially obscured by the hood of her jacket. She looked smaller, more fragile than he had imagined. There was no defiance in her posture, no arrogance, just a quiet, fearful stillness. She was alone. "Amber McKinney," Myers said softly as he approached the booth, his voice calm but firm. Amber didn't react at first. She didn't even look up. But Myers knew she had heard him. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment he wondered if she would run, if she would try to fight her way out. But she didn't. Instead, she slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide with recognition. "I didn't want to be found," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to be anyone anymore." Myers sat down across from her, keeping his distance. "Amber, we need to talk. What happened that day? What made you do it?" Amber's eyes shifted away, as if she were trying to avoid the question. She hadn't expected this to be so direct. She had spent weeks running from her past, running from the reality of what she had done. Now the weight of it was closing in on her. She couldn't run anymore. "I didn't want to kill them," she whispered. "I just wanted out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't be who they wanted me to be anymore. So I thought if I made everything go away, I'd be free. But I was wrong. I thought it would work. I thought I'd escape. Myers leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. But it didn't work, did it? Amber, you didn't just escape. You destroyed everything. You destroyed your family, and now you're running from the consequences of what you did. Why? Amber's face contorted with a mix of guilt and fear. She had expected to feel free after the fire, after her escape, but now all she felt was emptiness. The fire had been her attempt to destroy the life she'd hated, but she hadn't realized what it would cost her. I thought if I killed them, I would be free of all the pressure, she said, her voice breaking. But instead I'm trapped. I can't go back. I can't undo it. I don't know who I am anymore. Myers let her speak, knowing that her words were the confession he needed. Amber wasn't just a girl who had snapped. She was someone who had been consumed by the weight of expectations, someone who had tried to erase herself and the life that had suffocated her. But in the end, she had only destroyed the one thing that mattered, the very family she had once wanted to escape. As Amber's tears began to fall, Myers felt a strange mix of sorrow and responsibility. She had tried to break free from the prison she had created, but now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The road to redemption would be long, and it would start with her facing the truth of what she had done. You're not alone, Amber, Myers said quietly, his voice steady. But you have to take responsibility for this. It's the only way you'll ever be free. Amber looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear, regret, and resignation. She knew he was right. She had taken everything from herself, from her family. Now she had to face the truth of her choices. Myers took a deep breath. Amber McKinney's escape had ended, but her journey toward understanding and atoning for her actions was just beginning.